The trend line really started going up for illegal immigration crossings under the Trump administration, and then it continued to soar underneath the Biden administration. And while I think that there is a concern, I think that there is a major humanitarian crisis that's going on, I think that we need a more market-based immigration system. The top-down approach of a border wall, of a lot of other things that are being spent money on to control what's happening in the border, I think are ultimately going to fail. Why? Because it's government. Hello, welcome again to this week's economy. I'm your host, Dr. Vance Ginn. Thank you for joining me today. We've got a lot to talk about, so I really want to get right into it. But first of all, Happy New Year. We're right in the new year now, January 5th, already, 5th day of 2024. I hope you're having a prosperous 2024. We've got a lot to do this year. My word for the year is joyful. Looking forward to having a lot of joy. Looking forward to doing this in 2024, to being joyful, but also meeting many of you and working with many of you in the process, as there's going to be a lot to do in 2024. Let's get right to it, though. The national news, the big thing that I think was out there was that the gross federal debt now exceeds $34 trillion. $34 trillion with a T. That is now 122% of GDP. Remember, the total economic output, more than 100% of that. So this is just ridiculous. So remember, this is all at usdebtclock.org. So go and check that out. But what it shows is that out of that $34 trillion, the debt per citizen, so how much each one of us owes of that debt, is $101,236. So many people on average are making about $60,000 a year across the United States. So it takes about a year and a half, almost 2 years, to pay off that amount of debt that they're working or not being able to get the rewards from their work. So that's not a good idea. And then remember, there are a fewer number of taxpayers that are actually, because it's per citizen is per man, woman, and child that are out there. But debt per taxpayer is $264,090. So almost $265,000 is how much you owe in debt if you're paying for the federal debt, if you're paying taxes. And it's just crazy, right? I mean, yeah, U.S. federal spending is about $6.3 trillion, and the budget deficit so far this year is $1.7 trillion, probably going to exceed $2 trillion. It's just really ridiculous what we're seeing here. If you look at U.S. federal debt to GDP ratio over time, in 1960, it was at 53%, 1980, 34%, 2000, 60%, and now 122%. So, I mean, this is just all about the excessive government spending that's happening. A lot of it is under the Biden administration, as we've had about $10 trillion more dollars in spending, a lot of that going to the national debt. But there was also a lot that was added under the Trump administration during the lockdowns, the massive increases of the CARES Act and other sort of packages that were put out there. The first 3 years also had quite a bit of spending underneath the Trump administration and Congress, really, right? They're the ones that pass all these budgets. I don't think it was due to the tax cuts. Remember, this is a spending problem, not a revenue problem. But you do have a dip whenever you make tax cuts in taxes initially, and then they can grow more later as you have incentives and everything else that changes throughout the economy. But what didn't happen was when those tax cuts were put in place, there was not the spending restraint. And so that is the big thing that we need to make sure that we look at moving forward. And when you put in some more of this other information that's going on at the federal level, you know, this was never going to be transitory inflation. Some are out there talking about this now. Paul Krugman, some others are saying, look, it was transitory inflation. The inflation rate is moderating now. It's closer to 3% after being 9% back in 2022. And that's true. It is moderating. It's coming down, but it's still growing at a pretty rapid rate, more than 50% higher than the average inflation rate target by the Federal Reserve of 2%. So that's not a good sign. And when you look at the amount of the increase in the assets of the balance sheet by the Federal Reserve, you could see that this was not going to be transitory, right? Which just means temporary inflation. They were calling for that because of the supply side effects that they saw during the shutdowns and how this influenced a lot of supply chains across the globe and other things that were happening. And those were important. But remember, those are individual markets, individual situations of where those prices are going. So you look at relative prices. When you look at the basket of goods and services of the general level of inflation across the economy, that's when you look at the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, the personal consumption expenditures, the chain Consumer Price Index. Those measures are more of a basket of goods and services, and those are all rising at a rapid rate. And that's where you get the inflationary pressures that come from increasing the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve too much compared to the growth in the economy. Too much money chasing too few goods is what Milton Friedman, my favorite economist, always said. And that is why this was always going to be persistent inflation. And it's still around. It's still going to be around for a while. Even the Federal Reserve, they're talking about cutting interest rates by 3 times this year, which could mean lower mortgage rates and lower interest rates, which I've been talking about in the news here recently, which could be good for many of us, right? But they're also saying that inflation is not going to hit back to 2% until 2027. 2027. So this is going to be a long time with us overall. And I think that they're also going to have a lot of other issues at the Fed as they're running over $100 billion in losses right now. If this would have been a company in the private sector, they would have went out of business or shut down for a little bit, right? But this is a public-private partnership known as the Federal Reserve. It's created publicly by Congress, but it's run or funded privately by banks across the country. And so what you have then is a situation where there are no incentives for them to close down, like I would like for the rest of the Fed. And so they're going to continue to run with these bad decisions. And that's one reason why I think that they're saying they're going to lower interest rates this year, is because those higher interest rates are really affecting their ability to operate, their ability to not run these losses. And with the government debt being over $34 trillion and having about $1 trillion just on net interest payments, the more that those higher interest rates stay higher for longer, the more costly it's going to be to finance that debt. And they want interest rates not to keep soaring. And so they're going to keep flooding money in the economy, which is going to contribute to price pressures going up, inflation going up. And so let's keep an eye on that as we move forward. Another big thing that I've been looking at recently, and there was a good chart on this about immigration, where the chart showing, I'll put this in the show notes page, vanceginn.substack.com, were more illegal immigrants than American births since August of 2023. So what that means is that they were showing that the illegal immigrants were coming in at a faster pace in America than the American births. And so there are more, quote unquote, illegals than there are Americans being born. And so there has been a lot of consternation, concern across the Twitterverse, Xverse, if you will, and social media about this. Now, one of my good friends, Alex Narasta from Cato Institute, who I've had on the show before, he talks about how these are just numbers of crossings. And so one crossing a legal immigrant could come over multiple times. And so this isn't a one-for-one picture of what's going on for illegal immigrants crossing the border, whereas American births, those are one-for-one. So these aren't apples to apples comparison. But even with that, what you see is that there is a trend upward from more illegal immigrants coming to America after the Trump lockdowns. And I'm starting to call this the Trump lockdowns now because, look, I was part of the administration when all that stuff went down as chief economist at the Office of Management and Budget. There were a lot of people who didn't necessarily want that to happen. I certainly didn't. I voiced that while I was there, but there were many who did. And while the federal government didn't necessarily shut things down, they put a lot of information out about slowing the spread and everything else of COVID-19 that gave the incentive for states and governors in particular to shut down their economies. And then Trump came in and said, look, this is good, and kind of basically blessed it that was a good idea. And so at the end of the day, it comes down to the Trump lockdowns, which ended up in the lockdown recession. And so that's not a good situation that we had. But what it also did is that there was a global movement for a lot of countries to lock down their economies. And as they did that, the places that were the poorest, that didn't have this much support and everything else, especially in Latin America, Central America, things of that nature, it was in their best interest. They were incentivized to go to a place that was going to provide more job opportunities and things of that nature, more freedom in some sense compared to where they were. And so they were flocking to America. Just like a lot of the blue states, progressive states, those people are flocking to red states, conservative states. We saw that with countries as well. What else did we expect? And so the trend line really started going up for illegal immigration crossings under the Trump administration, and then it continued to soar underneath the Biden administration. And while I think that there is a concern, I think that there is a major humanitarian crisis that's going on, I think that we need a more market-based immigration system. The top-down approach of a border wall, of a lot of other things that are being spent money on to control what's happening in the border, I think are ultimately going to fail. Why? Because it's government. It's a top-down approach. Just like the immigration situation over time, even under the Trump administration, was improving then some, but it was still failing according to a lot of people, is that it was a top-down approach from government failure, not having the knowledge available for how many people need to be here, the amount of demand that was going to be here. And then we've run into all these labor shortages and everything else. The direct result from that, and part of it's also from the illegal drug trade. I think there's also a big picture here that we need to do something about, a war, quote unquote, war on drugs that has been a complete failure. I think we need to be decriminalizing a lot of the drugs that are out there, especially the minor sort of drugs, if not legalizing entirely, putting more emphasis back on the people to have personal responsibility instead of taking it out of their hands and putting it on government and politicians, and then making our law enforcement have to go after all these small things when they should be going after the bigger things. I mean, I think it just makes common sense, but it wins politically. I mean, both the left and the right are talking a lot about illegal immigration, border security, and everything else. I think we really need to get back to a market-based approach where you have prices of those who want to come in to the system, and the companies, the employers can pay for that to come here, put that money into reducing the national deficit. Think about that. And then allow for those people to be connected and hold accountability for the individual that is here and for the business. And we have a much better situation. We don't need to import, we don't need quotas and all this other stuff. We just need to make sure that we have this situation that allows for markets to work, and it's not working today. And I don't think that all the border security and the billions of other dollars that we're spending on this situation is going to solve the problem. Remember, there's trade-offs, and the massive trade-offs that are here are not solving the problem. And another big issue that I've been looking at, I'm going to talk a lot about this over the year, is that when you look at the GOP candidates in particular right now we just have one Democrat candidate, it being President Biden. So when you look at the GOP candidates, I mean, they're all out there attacking each other, when I think that if they continue to do that, they're, for one thing, going to put Trump more in the lead compared to everything else, because he's just going to sit back and say, hey, look at me, look what I'm doing. But at the same time, they're not coming out with a pro-growth approach. We need a pro-growth approach to revitalizing America, making sure that we're set on a prosperous path. And by doing that, what do we need to do? We need a cutting government spending, or at least reining in government spending to a spending limit of no more than population growth plus inflation that I've talked a lot about over time. We need to have tax cuts and making sure that we keep the Trump tax cuts in place, and making sure we're funding that through restraining government spending. And then we need to deregulate. There's just been so much regulation that's happened on the Biden administration, probably more costly than anything else that he's done underneath his administration, has been all the increases in regulation that brings up economic uncertainty, huge costs for businesses, and everything else. It's just a bad situation that's got to be overcome. But I don't hear Governor Haley of South Carolina, current Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, or even Vivek Ramaswamy, who probably has the biggest game. He's talked a lot more about his specifics than a lot of other folks, but I want to hear more of that in the debates and the discussions, and maybe some op-eds or something else. I'm glad to help. I'm always here to help. So if you know some of them, please send them my way, because we need a pro-growth approach. And I'm concerned that Trump will fall back to more of the tariffs, the big spending, and the populism, the national conservatism sort of approach that's just not good for the country at the end of the day. And so I'm looking for some other good opportunities for that, and maybe it's one of the libertarian candidates as well. Some of them have talked a good approach, but there still needs to be more meat on the bones for a lot of these policies. So I'm going to talk more about that, but there's a good overview for now. On the states news, 22 states raised their minimum wage. This influenced 10 million workers, with the highest minimum wage now being in Washington, state of Washington, at $16.28, and California and New York are now at $16 an hour. There are 38 cities and counties that are also raising their minimum wages, with the highest of $20.29 in Tukwila, sorry if I mispronounced that, Washington. What does this mean? This means that a lot of folks at the lower income, lower skilled part of the income ladder are not going to be able to, one, get a job, because they're going to be crowded out of the market. They're going to be priced out of the market. And it also means those with lower skills are going to be pushed out of the market, because a lot of employers are going to then want to hire and keep those with higher skills, more experience. Simple economics, right? The incentives really matter, even when it comes to the minimum wage. This is an arbitrary amount put in place by government, where in Texas, the state that just follows the federal minimum wage, which is currently $7.25 an hour. And there's a push by some to raise that, particularly on the left, to raise that minimum wage, saying it's too low, it's not a living wage, and all these things. But you got to remember that only 1.5% of hourly paid workers in Texas earn at or below the minimum wage. 1.5%. It's not a huge amount. More than a half of those are between the ages of 16 to 24. They're really just getting their foot in the door, moving up the income ladder. Their parents are probably helping them out. They've got other sources of income. And so this is just an arbitrary thing to do to raise the minimum wage, or really even have a minimum wage at all that's mandated by the government, because ultimately the wage is a price of labor. And it's a minimum wage is a control of the price of work. And so when you raise the price of work arbitrarily, like the minimum wage does, this creates a bad situation, especially for workers, but also for employers, to make up all these other trade-offs that they could do instead of providing more for their families, for workers, and for profitability for the employers to grow their business and do all those things, including provide for their families as well. So we don't need a minimum wage. We don't need to be raising these minimum wages because it's going to create more higher prices, high price pressures overall, and more trade-offs in the market. I think what we need is a better education system with more school choice. We need lower taxes. We need less government spending in our lives. And if you do more of those things, people will get paid more. Their productivity will go up. And then that is how fewer people that'll be in and poverty overall. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. There's a lot of items on the Texas Republican primary ballot coming out in March. There's a huge list of them. I'm going to put a link to it, and I'm going to put some of my other information in there under the paywall. Remember, you get a paid subscription as well, only $50 for the year. So please go do that at vanceginn.substack.com. But when you look at these primary ballot initiatives, many of them are just like smoke and mirrors. It's all about the politics, the rhetoric behind the illegal immigration. What can we do more of? And I just think, again, like I said earlier, a lot of this is going to be for naught because ultimately we need Congress to change the immigration laws, to reform immigration laws to a market-based system. And all Texas can do, I know there's a lot of grief and anguish about all the people that are coming to Texas this way, but there's not going to be enough resources for us to stop the flow in Texas. This is a humanitarian crisis that needs to be done, but we need a more market-based approach instead. So I think that there's a lot of these things that are just not good propositions that the GOP in Texas in particular should not be following. There was a good one, though. Number one was on eliminating property taxes. I'm all about that. We should have the God-given right to own our property. And as long as we have a property tax system in place, we're always going to be renting from government. So we need to get rid of that. And I've got several ways that we can do that as well. There was a good piece in Fox News about welfare reform, in particular by Daniel Erspamer at the Pelican Institute and Greg Sindelar at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, where they talk about the need to bring in a one-door policy approach and really to allow for states to have competition on what's going to work best for poverty relief initiatives. So I'll put a link to that, but it's a really good one. Something I've been talking about a lot for a while with the Alliance for Opportunity and others. I think empowerment accounts are a big part of that as well. But don't miss that. For my media and other hits that I've had recently, I was on NTD News talking about interest rates potentially falling this year, what that's going to mean for housing prices in 2024. So I'll be sure to put a link to that. I was on another NTD News interview all of January 1st, actually, in the morning and in the evening on the economic outlook for 2024, which I think, there's going to be a lot of economic uncertainty, especially with the politics that's going on and what we have there, but also what the Federal Reserve is going to be doing. So it's going to be, buckle up. It's going to be an interesting time for sure. I had a good piece out in American Institute for Economic Research, where I am now a writing scholar there, which I'm thankful to be doing that. But basically what I talk about on there is about what America can learn from President Milei in Argentina, basically slashing regulations, reducing the number of agencies by more than half, government agencies, and talking about cutting government spending and everything else. This is what we need in America to really unleash the economic potential for the future. Don't miss that one. I had a radio interview with Newell Normand on WWL NOLA on changes in the tax code in 2024, the federal tax changes. There's a lot of stuff, raising the standard deduction, raising a lot of those tax brackets based on inflation of about 5%. A lot of this was done in the Trump tax cuts, which were very supportive of pro-growth initiatives. But a lot of those things are also going to be expiring in 2025, which is going to bring up a lot more of uncertainty. So don't miss that interview. I'll also be today throughout the weekend at the American Economic Association meetings in San Antonio, where I'm not presenting, but I'm going to go meet with a lot of folks, see what's going on there, and network. This is something that's important and it's nearby. And so I'm like, hey, I'm going to go ahead and go check it out. Regarding some other things that are going on, the last LPP, Let People Prosper episodes with Dr. Mark Calabria on housing affordability. Don't miss that. Great discussion with him. And the upcoming Let People Prosper episodes with Adam Thierer on permissionless innovation in technology, on other things that are out there is a great discussion that's going to come out on Monday. So you don't want to miss that. And then the other big thing here is an announcement of the 3 winners for the annual paid subscription to my Substack newsletter at vanceginn.substack.com and the book, The Soul of Civility, by Lexi Hudson, where they will get a book and they will get the paid subscription. And it is Helen Cordell, Dorothy Harbeck, and Jacob Felix. Thank you all so much for going through, providing a rating and review for all my information, for my podcast and everything else. I hope that others will do that as well. Please give me a 5-star rating. That would be great. And write a review. This really helps with all the algorithms and everything else. So the last two things. One is quote of the week is by my favorite economist, Milton Friedman, the GOAT. The great virtue of a free market system is that it does not care what color people are. It does not care what their religion is. It only cares whether they can produce something you want to buy. It is the most effective system we have. It is discovered to enable people who hate one another to deal with one another and help one another. I truly believe free market capitalism is the best path to let people prosper. And this is the big reason why. It helps to bring us together. No matter what our background is, we can come together. We need more of this, not less, in our economy, like some of the national conservatives want to do. Freedom conservatism is the way to go. Go check them out. And the Bible verse of the week is Psalms 143:10. Teach me to do your will, for you are my God. I think that's going to be so important about this year. It's something I'm praying about for my word of the year, for being joyful. And I think if we turn more to Jesus, then we don't have to turn so much to politicians. We've gotten to where politicians want to be the first in line of defense for all the things that ail us. And the first line of defense should be Jesus, should be right, and putting that first through the Bible, the God's word. And the politicians should be at the back, not the front. We also need families and friends and civil society helping each other out. And that's really the way out of all this poverty and everything else that we have going in long term. So with that, I know it's running a little bit long because it's a lot of stuff going on, but I hope that you have a wonderful week. And until next time, let people prosper.